Hi, everyone, and welcome to the May APA webinar. We're going to let people get in the room, so just give it a few minutes and then we'll get started. Thank you so much for joining us.
So Jackie, I have 11:30. I think people are going to keep filing in, but do you mind if I just get us kicked off and before I hand it over to you?
Go for it, Jacob.
Great. Well, hi everyone, and welcome to the St. Louis Metro Section's May webinar, Prosperity Through Zoning Reform. I'm Jacob Trimble, president of the St. Louis Metro Section of the APA. And on behalf of the section board, thank you for being here today for what will be a thought-provoking topic presented by three leading-edge planning professionals. But some announcements before I hand it over to our moderator. First, please save the date for the summer picnic on June 21st at the Pat Connolly Tavern. This event is free for St. Louis Metro Section members, but registration is required and space will be limited. Keep an eye out for the registration link in Friday's newsletter. Number two, last call for board nominations. The St. Louis Metro Section uses the APA's consolidated election system, and nominations for board members are due this Friday, May 19th. If you're interested for running for a seat on the St. Louis Metro Section board and don't know how to get started, send me an email and I can help you out. And number three, call for sessions for the Bi-State Conference this October 11th through the 13th in Kansas City. Session proposals are being solicited and are due June 9th, 2023. Contact Missouri's chapter administrator Aishwarya for additional details. So with those out of the way, I want to introduce the group to our moderator for the day. Jackie Knight is a forward-looking transportation leader from the St. Louis region. She has a deep knowledge of the transportation planning sphere and has had a part in many of the best planning processes in our region in the recent past. Her dedication to our profession and her willingness to lead events like this one make her an invaluable asset to our organization. So Jackie, thank you, and take it away from here.
Thank you so much, Jacob. And as a transportation planner, this is a topic I'm so excited about because I think in the transportation realm, we're finally starting to understand the land use decisions that impact our transportation system. So thank you everybody for attending the APA St. Louis Metro Section Luncheon on Prosperity Through Zoning Reform. Like Jacob mentioned, my name's Jackie Knight. I'm a senior planner at Crawford, Murphy & Tilley in St. Louis and a member of the APA Advocacy Committee. We're so excited to have everybody here to learn about this topic. Just so everybody understands, the goal of our local advocacy committee is to plan events that align with the American Planning Association federal policy priorities. For 2023, those priorities address issues of climate action, infrastructure, and our topic today, zoning reform. The APA acknowledges that planning-led zoning reform is key to tackling some of the greatest challenges facing our communities today. As we embark on this new chapter in planning, we are thrilled to welcome this panel to discuss the issue and need, as well as highlight examples of zoning reform and success within their respective communities. So without further ado, please let me introduce you to this panel, who is surely going to get you excited about zoning reform. And I've heard Nolan mention on a few podcasts, it might be the most exciting dinner party conversation that you're going to have. So we are delighted to have the panel moderated by Arbitrary Lines author, Nolan Gray. Nolan is the research director for the California YIMBY and an expert in urban land use regulation. He is the author of Arbitrary Lines, How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It, which I can personally say is an excellent and informative read. And Gray previously worked as a planner in New York City, where he worked on the front lines of zoning. He is a widely published author with work appearing in outlets such as The Atlantic, Bloomberg City Lab, and The Guardian. He lives in Los Angeles, California, and is originally from Lexington, Kentucky. Today, we also have on the panel Meg McMahon. Meg is a director of planning for the city of Minneapolis, where she works to leverage development and regulatory systems that drive equitable outcomes. Prior to Minneapolis, Meg worked for the city of Brooklyn Center, Minnesota as the community development director, where she led the department through a transitional time, which resulted in new ordinances, policies, and approaches that were community-centered and met with the needs of a diverse and dynamic citizenry. She received her master's in urban and regional planning from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs and her BA in sociology from Hamline. When she isn't working, she's most likely camping with her family along the north shore of Lake Superior or the boundary waters of Canoe area in northern Minnesota. Welcome, Meg. And then finally, we have Chris Hawley. Chris is a city planner in Buffalo, New York. Since 2009, he has worked in the City of Buffalo's Office of Strategic Planning, where he is focused on historic preservation and zoning reform. He was instrumental in the writing and adoption of Buffalo's Green Code, a citywide form-based code which went into effect in 2017 and was the recipient of the Form-Based Code Institute's Dry House Award in 2019. Chris previously worked for U.S. Senator Charles Schumer and Buffalo developer Howard Dembski. He has a degree in Metropolitan Studies from New York University. So welcome to our amazing panelists. And with that, I will turn it over to Nolan to get started.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jackie. And thanks everyone for having me here. Let me get my slides up. Okay. Everybody can see that okay? I can only see panelists. If one of the panelists would give me a thumbs up, that'd be
very good.
Fantastic. Okay, great. My name, as Jackie said, I'm Nolan Gray. I'm the research director for a group called California YIMBY. We work to pass pro-housing zoning reform state legislation here in California. I'm a former professional city planner. And I have my New York City planning mug this morning. Always got to get a mug. I want to start things off here. When I say YIMBY, what do folks think of here? Feel free to drop it in the chat. On the West Coast, we're starting here at 9 a.m. So a little bit of a waking up exercise. And hopefully in St. Louis, you're further along than I am. Okay, good. We got some answers coming in here. Yes, in my backyard. Okay, abundant housing. Unfortunately, the opposite of what we normally see. Not being misanthropic. Okay, that's nice. Great. No, these are all fantastic answers. I'll say here at the outset, I think, when I give talks to folks across the country, I think a lot of folks actually think of this. They think of San Francisco, not without reason. This is where the YIMBY movement really starts. This is where a severe housing affordability crisis and then the attendant issues of homelessness and sprawl really sort of hit a fever pitch earlier than the rest of the country. And of course, this is where YIMBY starts. But over the course of the talk today, I'm going to make the case that zoning reform and a lot of the ideas that the YIMBY movement espouses are actually just as relevant, if not even more relevant, for cities staging a comeback like St. Louis. And I'm excited about what some of the other speakers will talk about. on this front. So first, for the people who live happy, normal lives and don't know too much about zoning here, I'll set the table just a little bit. Zoning is a state delegated power to local governments to adopt essentially two key documents. The first is a zoning ordinance, setting out a list of zoning districts and what isn't and is not allowed in every single district. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then a zoning map that assigns every single parcel in a city to a zoning district. There are two main pillars to zoning regulations. The first is use regulation or use segregation. So most people know, for example, the broader project of zoning of separating industrial, residential, and commercial, but it gets quite a bit more complex within those broad categories. You'll have multiple different types of residential, some of which will allow apartments, other of which won't. You'll have variation within commercial districts that might allow some commercial uses, but not others. And then, of course, the same with industrial. And while most people know, about the sort of famous examples of keeping factories away from schools, you can't really interpret modern zoning without understanding the social project that underlies a lot of what these regulations were trying to do. There's a clear notion of what a correct family and a correct mode of living and a correct neighborhood looks like. And as I'll argue in this talk, I think that's increasingly fallen out of step with our planning values today. The second thing that zoning regulations are doing is placing limits on the amount of housing or floor area or density that you can build on any particular lot. So again, most people here will know about things like height limits, controlling how tall a building can be, or setbacks, how close a building can sit to a parcel. But there are a whole thicket of other rules that will control how much floor area you can build, stuff like floor area ratios, FARs, or limits on the number of dwelling units per acre. Sometimes these are exclusively focused on the actual form that the building takes. Other times these are much more prescriptive. Onto the fun stuff here. So what went wrong with zoning? The first and of course most important consideration where I work here in California is the relationship between zoning and the housing affordability crisis. Essentially what we have in many California cities as well in cities and suburbs all across the country is a set of zoning rules that do three things. First, they often restrict new supply. They often set mandates that go above and beyond any health and safety consideration and increase the cost of housing. And then third, they subject many projects to a slow and often unpredictable entitlement process. What land use planners might know as discretionary permitting, requiring the projects go through multiple public hearings or file additional paperwork. In the case of California, environmental reports, even for things like fourplexes, and potentially put themselves at risk, closing out a lot of smaller operators. Of course, this is as true in a place like metropolitan Los Angeles as it is in a place like metropolitan St. Louis. So here you can see a very simplified land use map of metropolitan St. Louis. And of course, you can see in many parts of the region, you have rules in place that might only allow single family homes. So it might be altogether illegal to build things like townhouses, duplexes, small multifamily buildings. In other parts of the region, there might be rules on the books that require, for example, large lot sizes that increase the cost of housing and essentially put a lower bound on the price of housing. Essentially saying if you can't afford a home of a certain quality, you don't get to live in a certain place. Of course, I think most relevant in many of these cities like St. Louis and peer cities is the relationship between these policies and segregation. I think there's this notion sometimes that, well, these rules had accidental segregationist outcomes. These cities accidentally segregated our cities, and it couldn't be further from the truth. In many cases, these rules that limit the types of housing or place price floors on certain forms of housing in many neighborhoods were explicitly designed with segregationist intentions. Modern Euclidean zoning, essentially the zoning system that most US cities and suburbs have today, emerged in the aftermath of the Buchanan v. Worley decision. What was happening in the 1910s was that many jurisdictions were adopting explicitly racial zoning, where they said that whites could live in this neighborhood and blacks could live in that neighborhood, and there would be no mixing. This is from a referendum on this issue actually in St. Louis. And this was a really, really nefarious system. In a rare moment of clarity on racial issues in Buchanan v. Worley, the Supreme Court rejected explicitly racial zoning. But what happened in the aftermath of that was that many cities adopted codes that effectively achieved the same results, but without ever mentioning race. So essentially what you could do is you could say, if you could allow certain types of housing or place price floors on certain types of housing in certain neighborhoods, you could effectively achieve class segregation, which of course in the US context translated into racial segregation. Here on the right is a snippet from Euclid v. Ambler, the 1926 decision that ruled our current system of zoning to be constitutional. Justice Sutherland refers to apartments and presumably the people that live in them as mere parasites who sap the vitality of neighborhoods. And there's also some very funny stuff in there about how raising a child in an apartment is completely unthinkable. Somewhat humorous, but also very nefarious in its intention. Here, this is a case that, of course, most of us will have learned in planning school. This was turned up to 11 as America suburbanized. So in many cases, suburbs actually incorporated and adopting zoning codes explicitly in response to a proposed multifamily or affordable housing project that might have brought more diversity and affordability to the community. This is the case of Blackjack in metropolitan St. Louis, where it was not particularly subtle. A project was proposed and the city scrambled to adopt zoning codes that banned multifamily housing. Of course, today they might frame what they were doing as protecting community character, but it was very clear what they were up to. And I want to reiterate that that was the intention of these rules, and these rules in many cases are still on the books. So I've talked about affordability, I've talked about racial and class-based equity. I think another major cost of what's gone wrong with our current rules is the environmental cost. So of course, we're all sort of thinking very seriously, hopefully in planning, about climate change and the need to foster patterns of growth that minimize our impact both on the land and in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Ironically, in many cases, our zoning codes are working in the complete opposite direction of those values. So of course, if you wanted to build something like the image on the left, a row of townhouses, very energy efficient, very land efficient. In many cases, prices would suggest that many people actually want to live in communities like that. Good luck. It's often going to require a very costly and risky entitlement process. If you want to build something like the thing on the right, in most US metro areas, you will have absolutely no problem. They will roll out the red carpet for you and it will be very easy to build. And as soon as it's built, a framework of zoning that prevents it from turning into anything other than a bunch of single family homes will be adopted. A similar thing is we often just explicitly write auto dependence into law. So here, for example, on the left is an image from DC. If you walk around historic neighborhoods in DC, you see these types of buildings everywhere. It's currently being used as residential use, but it's a pretty funny looking home, I would say. Most homes don't seem to have showrooms built in. That's because it wasn't originally built as a home. It was originally a corner shop that might have had something like a grocery or a doctor's office or a barbershop, a daily neighborhood commercial use. Zoning presumes that residential and commercial must be strictly segregated and that you will live in one place and drive and shop in another. This is simply not a sustainable pattern of development. And I want to be clear here, we often write auto dependence explicitly into law. So we say, for example, if you want to build an apartment, you cannot build, say, a 2-bedroom apartment without doubling the amount of space that resident will have to consume and provide 2 parking spaces, regardless of whether they want it or not, regardless of whether they might be in a neighborhood, regardless of whether they might be in a neighborhood where they might be able to walk or take a train or ride a bus. In many cases, zoning does not give folks the choice to live car-free or car-light lifestyles. Okay, now everyone is sufficiently depressed. The good news is that I think there's a huge amount of reform energy on this issue. And the next few panelists are going to have really fantastic examples, but I'm going to talk about 3 broader principles of zoning reform that I think are especially relevant for a city like St. Louis metro area. The first is legalize what already exists. I encounter so many jurisdictions that have this wonderful historical housing and commercial built stock that would, in many cases, is of course illegal to build today, but also is legally very difficult to rehabilitate or adaptively reuse. There might be massing or density standards that put most properties into non-conforming status, or there might be minimum parking requirements that make it literally impossible without significant zoning relief for these properties to be reused as commercial uses. You know, and of course, in most of these jurisdictions, they'll say, well, we give out variances whenever people ask for them. But of course, a variance is not guaranteed. A variance might throw up additional issues for lending, and variances aren't cheap. They cost fees, they cost planning, public sector capacity, they take time. And toward what ends? Would this building here on the right really be improved if the building on the left was demolished and turned into a parking lot? I would suggest not, and it certainly wouldn't be advancing our planning goals. The good news is that many cities are reckoning with these rules and removing minimum parking requirements altogether. As we'll hear about here in a minute, Buffalo was the first city to do this in 2017, completely removing minimum parking requirements, really kicking off, as the next speaker will discuss, an adaptive reuse boom that continues to this day. Around the same time, Hartford, Connecticut did something very similar. And we're seeing this in cities all across the country that have this historical housing and commercial stock that can't be used as long as current parking requirements are in place. But once they're removed, really magical things can start to happen. The second is legalize what you want to exist. Again, so many jurisdictions that I think are wrestling with the challenges of reinvestment or impending recovery have zoning codes that might often make it illegal to build precisely the types of things that would build strong and affordable communities. Say, missing middle housing, low-rise multifamily, the townhouses and two-bedroom condos that really are starter homes in 2023, the types of homes that might actually be affordable to the folks who have stuck by the city and would like to have a home and remain in their community. Make it legal, and this is really, really important, make it by right. Make it very easy to build the types of things that your community wants. And I'll say too, you know, of course, when in cities where home prices are still relatively low and really poverty is more of the issue, it's easy to sort of not necessarily take these problems too seriously. Why do we need to grow the overall housing stock? Well, because recovery is going to come, and the best time to fix your zoning is before the recovery boom starts to kick off. You know, I think a good example here is the case of Philadelphia. Of course, Philadelphia has had an incredible resurgence over the last half decade. And I think they're very, very well positioned for a lot of the changes that are happening because they made a lot of those zoning changes that allowed for types of infill housing that the city needed and wanted to happen in an as of right way. And so they've actually been able to build the housing. As the recovery has really started, they've been able to build the housing at scale to where all of that growth pressure wasn't falling on existing units and pricing folks out and potentially even resulting in renters being displaced. Third, and finally here, I think it's important to have a statewide conversation about zoning. You know, it's fantastic if we can have one or two local jurisdictions, particularly larger cities where these decisions are really important, adopt zoning reforms. But we also need to be having a broader state conversation. There are, of course, here in Metro, St. Louis County, for example, there are 90 jurisdictions, right? Purely reforming zoning at the local level is going to be very long and difficult. And of course, for many local jurisdictions, the politics will never line up to facilitate that. It's important that we have state governments put up guardrails around commonly abused zoning powers and take measures to ensure that every jurisdiction is building its fair share of housing. It's important that we not only remove barriers to inherently affordable forms of housing, but also that we make sure that more of that housing is being built in the right places and high opportunity places and not being offloaded onto marginalized, politically disempowered communities. And frankly, that's going to take state or at the very least regional coordination. I promised myself I wasn't going to talk too much about California here, but I think we have a really exciting, successful example of a statewide approach working really well. This is in 2016, the state legalized accessory dwelling units statewide. So for those who don't know, I'm sure you can find ADUs everywhere in Metro St. Louis, but for those who don't know, ADUs, otherwise known as granny flats or mother-in-law units, are additional apartments that homeowners might add in unused garages or basements or attics. As the name might suggest, these are often rented to aging parents who folks want to keep close, or they're built by aging homeowners who want to be able to age in place but don't need all the space that they have, or increasingly used to house young professionals who maybe aren't ready to buy a home but would like to have their own unit. When California set statewide standards for ADUs in 2016, essentially protecting the right of homeowners all across the state to build ADUs, what we immediately saw was that homeowners eagerly lined up to start building these units. We started seeing, we've seen tens of thousands of new ADUs built all across the state, especially in higher opportunity neighborhoods characterized by detached single family homes that in many cases hadn't built a single new home in 30, 40, 50 years. This is the potential power. This is the scale of revitalization and reinvestment that you can achieve, I think, when you take some of these questions to the state level. Those are my three broad principles for reform. I hope I set up the issues up well. I'm very excited, of course, to hear from the next few speakers here. Feel free to stay in touch. Here's my email and my Twitter handle. And of course, if any of this was even vaguely interesting to you, my press would like me to remind you that I have a book on the subject. So thank you again to St. Louis chapter of the Missouri APA, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Nolan. And you can tell your press that I will also advocate for your book. It is an excellent read. So I hope everybody that's logged in today is vaguely interested in the subject. That's why you're here. And so with that, we'll move into the next presentation, Meg, and we will reserve Q&A for the end. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A box. We're so excited to open the discussion once we get through the presentation. So I will turn it over to Meg.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you see the presentation? We're good. Awesome. So thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon. So my name is Meg McMahon. I'm the planning director at the city of Minneapolis. So thank you for having me. And before we dive in into the details here, I just want to provide some context in case you aren't familiar with Minneapolis. So we're at the center of a 13+ county region. Cities within the central 7 counties of the region are required to complete a comprehensive plan every 10 years. So the 7-county metro area is under the Metropolitan Council, which is a unique regional planning entity that, among other things, oversees that comprehensive planning process. So you can see that Minneapolis is relatively small geographically compared to our region. We account for only about 14% of our regional population. We have added about 50,000 residents in the past 10 years, and we do expect to add another 50,000 over the next 20 years. So by some measures, racial inequity is worse in Minnesota than anywhere else in the country. So much has been written about this, and it's really a decades-long problem. And while the inequities are stark, we do recognize that we have an opportunity here that some other communities might not have. So what we find is that aggregated data paints a pretty good picture for Minnesota in terms of affordability and wealth and opportunity. But when you start to dig into disaggregated data by race, the disparities become really quite stark. So when we began our comprehensive planning process, which, as I had said before, is regulated by our Metropolitan Council, so they kick that process off. It's a routinized every 10-year process. And so we really began those efforts in 2015, began ramping up, and then most of our community engagement was really done 2016 to 2019. And so in these early stages of public engagement for our comprehensive plan, which we've called Minneapolis 2040, we worked with stakeholders and elected officials and really established 14 overarching goals. And the goal of eliminating disparities stood out as a common thread that really needed to be woven through all of our proposed policies and action steps and regulations that came out of the plan. So since we first embarked on this work, this practice has definitely become more commonplace. But back in 2015, I think planners were just starting to think about and really talk about shedding light on the historic and unfortunate continued traumas that have been inflicted on BIPOC communities through the planning profession and other related disciplines. And that was really a cornerstone of the work when we began. So we thought that this reality and awareness of our history was an integral part of figuring out what to do next. And so early on, we partnered with an organization called Mapping Prejudice. And this is a group of researchers working out of the University of Minnesota, working to shed light on the practice of racially restrictive covenants in Minneapolis. So we combined their work into our narrative and connected the dots between racially restricted covenants, redlining practices, FHA underwriting manuals that encourage the use of zoning as a de facto segregation tool, to really tell the story of why Minneapolis looked the way it looked. Why is it one of the most segregated cities in the United States, and to really to make that foundational in our engagement and in how we talked about planning for the future. And so this is an example of a copy of a racially restricted deed attached to a home in South Minneapolis. And what we find is that these are really quite prevalent in many parts of our city, and even into our first and second ring suburbs that were developed back when these were legal. So these practices work together over time to restrict access to opportunities for wealth building, access to the best parks and schools, and locations that afforded residents transportation options for accessing jobs. And so these practices didn't just end 50 years ago. Black Americans were unequally issued loans with unfavorable terms, leading right up to the 2008 housing bubble. And still today, on a national level, homes in majority Black neighborhoods are undervalued by $48,000 per home on average. So the result in Minneapolis is an incredibly segregated community by race and by nearly every outcome you can imagine. So before we get to some policy solutions, I want to underscore this topic a little bit more. So that is to say that housing affordability in Minneapolis, and really this is true for cities across the US, is a racial equity issue. So yes, everyone is being impacted by rising housing costs, but what we really looked at and have seen in Minneapolis is that our Black and Brown communities are suffering much more than others. And so here you can see which parts of the city were affordable to Black households on the left, Latino households in the center, and white households on the right between the years 2000 and 2014. So the landscape of affordability has changed drastically for these populations in a really negative way. So recall that we'd established 14 goals at the outset of the project. And so when we asked folks to think about what the city would like if we achieved some of these goals, people frequently zeroed in on changing our zoning approach to single family areas as one means to increase access to diverse housing types, really to thinking about achieving complete neighborhoods and contributing to climate change resilience. So we got to work and we produced some ideas on how to address these issues. I think planners are really good at knowing the truth that there are some systemic problems that require systemic solutions. So that means bringing a whole host of solutions to the table. So today I'm really just going to focus my comments on addressing the issues around housing type diversity and supply. But the plan, our Minneapolis 2040 plan, is full of strategies regarding transportation and green infrastructure and economic development and economic recovery that really describe how we strive for more equitable outcomes across our enterprise. So it is a very comprehensive plan, but this really is focusing on the zoning components. So from a land use built form perspective, the question was, what can we do differently? So first, I'll talk about the elimination of single family zoning, since that's what folks generally want to talk about when we talk about zoning reform in Minneapolis. So in response to the public feedback that said we should be doing more in single family areas to diversify the housing stock, the initial proposal suggested that we would allow up to 4 units in areas furthest from downtown that were primarily single family, with the caveat that they could be no larger than what we already permitted single family homes to be, which in most cases is 2.5 stories and a max FAR of 0.5. So the idea being that if you can build this shell on the property, it shouldn't matter how many families live in the shell, right? And so that was something that was repeated over and over and over again at public meetings, by staff, by elected officials. And really the initial feedback to this plan was not overwhelmingly positive. So we had some elected officials that were really silent during this process. And as we were starting to talk about this as a potential solution, we had a couple leaders saying that maybe it could be a good thing. And then we had a couple elected officials that were pretty publicly concerned about the idea of allowing up to 4 units. So staff did do some design kind of fit testing. And essentially, long story short, we figured out that you really can't fit 4 units on a typical city lot. So we could have just allowed it and seen what the development community came up with. But we were in uncharted territory here. No other cities had done this. And so we didn't have a lot of peers to compare notes with. And frankly, I think at the end of the day, we wanted to get the policy adopted. And we saw that our best path for doing that was to limit the scale of the buildings to 3 units, so that we could still allow the additional units. So we did pull back to triplexes. I think one noteworthy tension here that I think is important to talk about is that Minneapolis made the decision to implement these changes citywide. And so what that meant was that there were compromises that had to be made when we were figuring out the solutions to the problems in order to build a broader political support and public support for the plan. So I know there are examples of cities now that have taken different approaches. I went to a session at a conference about Tulsa, and they implemented the removal of single family zoning much more narrowly, just in neighborhoods that were more politically favorable to it or already had some density. And as a result, they were able to go a bit further and focus on those neighborhoods where it wasn't strongly opposed. And I think, it's important to note that I think there's real pros and cons to the two approaches. And so it's probably something to think about and consider as you're looking at how you want to implement your zoning reform. So single family zoning is just one piece of the puzzle. Elsewhere in downtown, so in our core city, along our corridors and in areas closer to downtown, we made it clear that multifamily development was permitted, and that it should essentially happen by right. So what this means was really clear understanding of height minimums and height maximums, much less need for public hearing processes. We took the view that the comprehensive plan is the public hearing process. So setting the goals and agreeing ahead of time about what we'll achieve is what land use and development planning is all about. So really not deciding on a case-by-case basis whether we think a project meets those goals, because that's often where we found that the inequitable decision-making took place, because we have a ward system, depending on the opinion of a ward council person or that particular neighborhood. We were seeing that different development was happening in different places, and one of the primary and foundational goals of Minneapolis 2040 was to really remove that that more localized view of kind of neighborhood character, and to really apply these rules equitably throughout the city. So here are some examples. So this is we created built form overlay districts. So what we ended up doing was we split our zoning code into 2 parts. Every piece of property in the city has 2 districts assigned. It has a base land use district, and then it has a built form overlay district that applies to it. And so it's been really difficult for council members to figure this out, but we've been educating them, and I think we've had this in place now for 3 years, and so I think we kind of have it down now. But the idea is that the built form dictates the bulk and size, and the land use dictates what can go inside those buildings. So this is an example of our Transit 20 built form district. So this is a designation on your property that means that the building height must be at least 6 stories. You can't build something shorter than 6 stories, and no more than 20, unless there is some premium bumps that you can receive for affordability and sustainability to build taller. So this is typically applied on the fringe of downtown and near major transit stops. So proximity to transit was one of the key factors that we used to determine which built form designation would be assigned to which area. So the closer to transit, the larger the allowance. We do go up to a transit 30, which has a max height of 30. But again, we also have the larger minimum height requirements are put into place in those areas then as well. So then this is an example of our interior one. So this is our lowest density built form district, and these are for neighborhoods that are furthest from downtown. So these are typically single family today, where up to 3 units are now allowed. So before we move on, I want to just reiterate that this is only one part of our overall approach, where we permit more or much greater development potential on our corridors downtown, near transit stations. Even off corridors and neighborhood interiors closer to downtown, you can do much more than 3 units. So on larger lots in single family, or what have been historically single family neighborhoods closer to downtown, you can do 4 or more units. There really isn't a cap. It's just based on the lot size and then FAR. So just to kind of give you a timeline in terms of our regulatory structure. So in 2014, we legalized ADUs. We've amended our ADU policy over time to make them more permissive. And so there's been incremental changes to that legislation over time. 2016 to 2018 was really the policy creation and public engagement that went into our Minneapolis 2040 plan. In December of 2018, the draft of the proposal was adopted by the city council 12-1. And I don't know if it's a surprise, but the council member who voted against the plan did represent the whitest and wealthiest community in Minneapolis. So then it went through a kind of an interim adoption process. It had to go back to our Metropolitan Council for review. So this all takes a lot of time. In the meantime, we adopted an interim inclusionary zoning ordinance, and the plan then officially was adopted by the council in November of 2019 and went into effect January of 2020. And at that exact same time, the day it went into effect, we also then legalized 1 to 3 unit regulations and the inclusionary zoning on the same day. So at that point, we knew we had to rewrite our zoning code. And so again, as I said, we broke that into 2 pieces. The built form regulations went into effect January of 2021, which allowed a significant increase in density along the corridors throughout the city. And then since then, we've eliminated all off-street parking requirements and overhauled our TDM ordinance. So that's actually had a huge impact because it's made projects possible that absolutely would not have been possible if they had to provide off-street parking. And then we are just wrapping up our land use component. In fact, the council committee approved that yesterday, and it'll go to council for final action next week for all new base zoning. So we're really excited about that. So part of what these changes mean is that they allow for development in highly amenitized areas that have good schools and transit access and grocery stores, places that have intentionally seen little housing growth in the past few decades. So the changes bring us closer to the goals of increasing housing options and choice in areas of the city where there has historically been very little choice. Our goal also is to streamline the review process and make the type of development we want allowed by right. Minnesota has a 60-120 day law. What that means is when we receive a complete application, the city has to take action on that within 60 days. We can extend it to 120. If we do not take action on that application within 120 days, it is considered automatically approved. So as you can imagine, we don't miss that deadline. And it does really help us make sure we're moving things along and that things are happening quickly. So this is just a glimpse of the development regulation that we've put in place to achieve our stated goals around climate change and complete neighborhoods and increased job access and racial equity. All of these things require all the partners to be at the table and all the tools to be utilized. And so there's lots of other programs that we're working on. Just to kind of talk about, I guess, outcomes. So permit activity for the 1 to 3 unit development has actually been pretty modest. But extrapolated out to 2040, we'll see that this rate could end up with 1,000 new dwelling units in that category. But we expect that rate will increase if the housing market continues to tighten. So we'll see, and we'll continue to monitor that. One of the things we also monitor is just if the regulations that we do have are a barrier, and so we continue to keep an eye on that. And I think to some degree that's the case. The promise that was made that these new units, these new triplexes wouldn't be larger than single family homes has, I think, been difficult for developers and architects to design triplexes that fit into that shell. And we've had, to have some iterative conversations with developers over time. We are working on a sketchbook that we hope will be helpful for folks, but I think politically, we're just not at a place yet where we can start to pick at those regulations quite yet. So meanwhile, on kind of our moderate to large scale projects, permit activity continues to be really high. We've all been sort of expecting a dip in activity, but we've been saying that for years now and we haven't seen it. So I guess we'll see what happens in the future. But what you can see from these numbers is that we've started to see more moderate, what you can't see from these numbers is that we've started to see some real moderate scale projects, so projects under 40 units in parts of the city because of our adopted built form regulations and also because of the elimination of parking requirements that we've never seen development at this scale before. So it absolutely is making an impact in parts of the city that have not had this type of housing production up until this point. And then just a couple implementation strategy pieces. We do have a Minneapolis Home program. So this is a program specifically designed to center people of color and to eliminate racial disparities in home ownership. And so how this program has worked in tandem with our missing middle and built form regulations is that the city has acquired hundreds of pieces of property throughout the city. And so through this funding program, it's about $7.5 million a year. We partner with emerging developers, local developers to acquire those parcels and build affordable homes. And then we partner that with a home buyer support and access program to create perpetually affordable home ownership opportunities in these spaces. And so we've been able to increase the supply of units that we're producing because we're able to now build duplexes and triplexes and 4+ units on lots that would not have otherwise been available, and also then provide more affordable units as a result. And then also, I just wanted to cover our site plan review point system. So when we are designing or working with developers on designing these 1 to 3 unit dwellings, we do have a point system that we utilize to really help drive high quality design. And I think one of the things that's important and why high quality design matters is because this plan continues to be not fully accepted throughout the community. We continue to have pushback. And when we're building these units in neighborhoods that have not seen new housing development for a really long time or for decades, making sure that these units look nice and fit in with the character of the neighborhood as much as possible is important in maintaining that public support. And so I think this has been a really effective tool. The units that we have built are very attractive, and I think this is why. So lessons learned, I guess. I think this tension between scale and scope, the pros and cons of kind of a citywide versus a more localized or neighborhood approach, this tension is really important to understand and to really think about in your community when you're thinking about zoning reform, because we really need to balance between progressive, impactful reform, and we want to make a difference with the decisions we're making. And we also need to maintain political and public support. And I think we believe we've maintained that balance pretty well, but I will note that Minneapolis 2040, was adopted on went into effect January of 2020. And it is still in litigation, right? So we are going to court on June 7th again to determine the fate of Minneapolis 2040 and the lawsuit, the plaintiffs, it really is predicated around this issue of triplexes and a very visceral concern about how densification of low density residential neighborhoods, what impact that will have on neighborhoods. So I think spending ample time up front developing consensus on the outcomes that you're hoping to achieve is really, really important. And we did this by prioritizing engagement with stakeholders that were most impacted by the work we were doing. And then we went back and we got buy-in from elected officials to formally recognize these goals early in the process so that everybody could be held accountable to them throughout. I think that's been really important because we go back to them over and over again. I still talk to them when I'm talking to community members or new council members who maybe were elected on the basis of not liking Minneapolis 2040, and that's perhaps what they ran on. And now we have to work with them to get development done. And so we continue to go back to the early foundation of the plan over and over again. I think you need to acknowledge that if you want different outcomes, you have to change the practices. And I think that has to be noted publicly. And I think that has to just be acknowledged because it's a fact. And so this idea that we want different outcomes, but we're not going to change anything about our current regulatory system is, I think once you state it out loud, it helps people to kind of, I think, get more comfortable with that change. I think it's important to set up accountable structures so that you can change the course in the future as needed to stay on track to achieving your goals. And so I think that's still something we're maybe struggling with a little bit, is figuring out how to measure these outcomes. And I think really importantly is to build your regulations as much as possible into the policy documents. Don't punt on some of the tougher things, because when we went to adopt our base land use zoning, and it's 3 years after we've adopted Minneapolis 2040, and we have 9 new council members who weren't there when we adopted Minneapolis 2040, and we're explaining to them why these minutia changes within their individual wards that their neighborhood residents want, that are going to erode the plan, why they can't have those changes because it would require a comp plan amendment, right? So that, I think, was really an important piece. So with that, I will conclude. So thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much, Meg. The questions are rolling in, and so I do want to encourage everybody to continue putting your questions in. Whatever we do not have time to get to today, I think our panelists will follow up via email. So we'd love to see your questions come in. And I'll go ahead and just turn it over to Chris to talk about the great things Buffalo's doing.
All right, wonderful. Everyone can hear me okay? Good. So my name is Chris Hawley. I'm a senior planner with the city of Buffalo. And I've been with the city since 2009, when I was brought on initially as an activist and then as a city planner to design a new zoning code for Buffalo. And our ambition as activists and later as planning professionals was to completely replace the entire system of land use regulations in the city of Buffalo with something that matched our goals as a community. We announced this project on Earth Day in 2010, giving it the name the Green Code. In the site of a vacant gas station on Buffalo's east side that was later transformed into a public square surrounded by mixed-use development. We chose this location because it was a great example of how the ambitions of both our development community and neighborhood residents to resurrect our mixed-use walkable neighborhoods was in complete conflict with the land use regulations that were in place. So this district on Buffalo's east side was rezoned in 1953 as a single-use industrial park, despite having existed as a mixed-use walkable neighborhood since the early 19th century. So the zoning code was adopted in 2017. We went back to the same site a few years later to celebrate its unveiling. And as with any comprehensive zoning rewrite, always recommend that it's based first on a comprehensive plan or vision for the future development of the city. Ours is based on Buffalo's comprehensive plan adopted in 2006, won the Charter Award from the Congress for New Urbanism in 2009, had as its basic principles smart growth, sustainability. The Charter for the New Urbanism was built directly into our comprehensive plan, as well as fixing the basics and building on our assets like our Olmsted Park and Parkway system and the, at the time, untapped waterfront. To enact the principles in the code, and as activists, we pointed this line in the comprehensive plan consistently, we needed to adopt a companion zoning ordinance that would make the smart growth and sustainability principles credible and achievable. That was a line that convinced our mayor, Byron Brown, who at the time was really focused on making City Hall more business friendly, establishing rules and procedures that were more friendly to investment and reflective of community input. And so we set out in a community-wide conversation over the next 7 years. I kind of joke it was a 7-year-long, 2-year project to rewrite our zoning code that included about 244 public meetings, some as large as this one in Lafayette High School. We're very proud of the diversity that we were able to achieve in many of our meetings, others as small as meetings of block clubs and living rooms across the city. But our goal overall was to take our 1953 zoning ordinance, which had ballooned to 1,804 pages, and completely replace them. So as part of this project, we undertook to repeal 1,804 pages of regulations and replace it with a single unified development ordinance written in plain English, supplemented with helpful text, plain English text, tables, illustrations, and diagrams that is now only 334 pages. So substantial streamlining of our development regulations that builds on our planning legacy. We're one of few cities in the country that has a radial street pattern, in this case designed by Joseph Ellicott, the brother of Andrew Ellicott, who picked up the pieces in Washington, D.C. from Pierre L'Enfant under George Washington. One of a few cities in the country that has a radial street pattern, Washington, D.C., Detroit, and Madison, Wisconsin are the others. Overlaid onto which is an Olmsted Park and Parkway system, the nation's first, planned in 1870. This gave us some of our best public spaces like Niagara Square and the Olmsted Parkways. This is the parkways in Elmwood Village. We also have a remarkable legacy in the early 20th century, building on the City Beautiful movement. The Plan of Buffalo of 1922, among other things, planned for a civic square at the terminus of Court Street, giving us one of the best terminating vistas, I think, anywhere in America. We switched from neoclassical to Art Deco from 1922 to 1928 when the plan was realized. That also gave us, and by the way, it respected initially our mixed-use walkable neighborhoods. We were principally built out by 1950, and the pattern of dense, compact, walkable neighborhoods connected by public transit was really the pattern that was reflected in every single neighborhood in the 42 square miles of Buffalo. We also wanted to respond to our planning mistakes, and we thought that the adoption of the 1953 ordinance was one of the biggest mistakes that the city of Buffalo, like so many across the country, adopted, which attempted to impose a suburban, car-oriented, single-use vision on a city that was principally walkable, compact, and mixed use up until that point. The same ideas that were reflected in our zoning ordinance reflected our urban renewal program. This is Mayor Sedita and other downtown stakeholders gazing down at the downtown urban renewal project, which resulted in the destruction of our main shopping district. That's the Erie County Savings Bank, and the background being demolished, built 1890. And also saw the demolition of some of our best, most compact and racially diverse neighborhoods, like the Ellicott District, which was the very first urban renewal project in 1950, which wiped out 36 blocks of the city to the east of downtown. At the same time, of course, we severely undermined our public transit system, ripping out the streetcars in 1950, replacing them with buses, and running highways down the center of some of our Olmsted Parkways. This is Humboldt Parkway, designed by Frederick Olmsted on the east side, which was replaced with the Kensington Expressway, helping enable the depletion of our population and economy from Buffalo to its suburbs. So we needed to start from scratch from our standpoint, because we had a code that really hadn't seen a significant rewrite since 1953, when Elvis Presley released his first song, Memphis, Tennessee. And we hadn't had any citywide land use planning exercise since 1977, when Saturday Night Fever hit the movie screens. And of course, our code ballooned to such a large size that only land use attorneys and architects understand what it meant, and it no longer had any discernible relationship with what communities actually expected from future development in their neighborhoods. It's difficult to understand and apply, poorly organized and written, simply out of date. And I think, most importantly, from our perspective, it made walkable mixed-use development virtually impossible without multiple regulatory hoops to jump through. And walkable mixed-use neighborhoods is what we heard from neighborhood residents all across the city, is what folks really wanted to see. So this is suburban sprawl in the heart of the city, just an example, in this case in North Buffalo, of the kind of development that the code not only enabled, but legally required with its separated use zoning and especially its minimum parking requirements, and made it our traditional neighborhoods virtually impossible to replicate. We wanted to respond to increased market demand for walkable neighborhoods, and well as enable ongoing population growth. Although we didn't expect to see population growth in Buffalo when we started the project in 2010, by 2020, when the census figures were released, we learned that Buffalo actually had its first population increase since 1950. We gained 17,500 residents in the last census, about a 6.5% increase in population. So the timing in our comprehensive zoning rewrite was actually quite good, having wrapped it up in 2017, enabling the kind of walkable compact development that has facilitated and hopefully will continue to facilitate a population rebound in the city. We may be the fastest growing Rust Belt city in the country. The Green Code is a citywide form-based code that is intended to communicate the development standards of the city in clear and often illustrated standards. Every single zone in the city is an accompanying illustration that details under healthy market conditions how a neighborhood might look over time as the development standards are applied. In this case, the N3C mixed use center, which applies to many of our mixed use walkable centers throughout Buffalo. And the form standards are communicated through tables and illustrations that take you from empty parcel to fully articulated building, in some cases communicating most of those standards in a simple 2-page spread. So that's easy, not just for architects and land use attorneys to understand what standards apply, but also for neighborhood residents to understand what they can build on their parcel and what neighbors can build next door. Now, with any form-based code, use is still important, but not the central organizing principle. Instead of 1,804 pages of text detailing what specific uses are allowed where, the use table, which is now only 2 pages, shows what uses are allowed in each zone, what uses are allowed by special use permit, or in the case of a blank box, what uses are prohibited in certain zones. We also wanted to enact a clear and predictable approvals process. I think one of the really great things about the code is that it's written in objective standards that are intended to rely less on the public hearing process to shape development and more on objective standards based on community consensus, developed over the 7 years that we engaged the public in this whole process. And I think even the most complex project now has a guaranteed 62-day approval timeframe as long as they meet all the standards of the code. I think what we've become most famous for across the country, and why I'm getting phone calls increasingly, is that we were the first city in the United States to completely eliminate all minimum parking requirements. And I would say now that we've had practice at this reality since 2017, we've had it in effect for 6 years. We also have the most practice of any municipality in enacting this policy. And I think it actually has been the most profound in terms of its of how it has unlocked the development potential of the city. So instead of legally required outcomes like this, a large surface parking lot next to a research facility at the emerging Buffalo Niagara Medical Campus, we now have what we've called a market-based approach to parking. If you're a developer, a small business person, or a homeowner, you may provide off-street parking, but you're not required to. It's none of our business what number of parking spaces you provide. It could be 0 to hundreds. We do, however, have standards for screening, landscape, and managing stormwater. So it is a form-based approach to parking, detailing the placement and relationship to the public realm of parking, but the number is no longer regulated. And what that's done is essentially put other transportation alternatives on equal footing: walking, biking, taking transit, facilitating mobility impaired, and is helping us meet rising demand for public transit. We're one of the smallest cities in the country to have a light rail system with an underground portion. As like many form-based codes, the Green Code addresses both the private realm and the public realm. The city of Buffalo is the first municipality in New York State to adopt a complete streets ordinance in 2007. And now we have a policy on how to do complete streets. We incorporated with heavy visuals all the standards in the ITE's Walkable Urban Thoroughfares Manual directly into our zoning code, so that anytime a street is reconstructed or newly constructed or even restriped, the standards now for complete streets are built directly in. So we've been at this for 6 years. We've got a lot of built results to speak of. Thankfully, this occurred at a time when we had perhaps unexpected population growth, mostly due to an influx of immigrants and refugees. We're a very immigrant and refugee-friendly city, and the word has gotten out about that. But I think most interestingly is that once we adopted the code, and in particular, once we removed all minimum parking requirements, projects that would have had significant regulatory hurdles have been very easily enabled. The very first zero parking project, new construction under the code, was actually enacted in 2017. It's 15 Allen Street, adjacent to a Metro Rail station, 12 units above, 2 shops on the ground floor. Has worked out great. Downtown, we have a workforce housing development with 201 units of housing in our central business district. Not one off-street parking space provided. It is leased up immediately, mostly by folks who work and walk to downtown workplaces. We have other projects throughout the city that provide some parking, but not nearly as much as we've seen before. This is another kind of routine project, 1020 Elmwood Avenue, which embodies all of the intents and standards of our form-based code, as well as I think just a good overall and very typical example in Buffalo that we're seeing on a nearly monthly basis now being approved. Other larger scale projects, as a code that has enabled adaptive reuse significantly by removing parking requirements, by making our use standards much more liberal and open-minded, we're now seeing the development of substantial industrial heritage resources for a wide variety of uses. This is an example, Silo City. A series of mills and grain elevators that are being converted to housing, offices, and artist space, as well as a very cool bar. The Richardson Olmsted Complex, the H.H. Richardson designed New York State Insane Asylum, was vacant for decades, a National Historic Landmark, being converted to a hotel and apartments, set within a Frederick Olmsted designed park-like space. Not the kind of development at 600,000 square feet that could ever have been permitted with the minimum parking requirements we had in place at the time, but now faces a very easy approval process. I think that the biggest impact of the code has actually been on small scale development. And one of the provisions in the code that I'm most proud of is section 6.1.1.f, which is an exception to the use table, which has essentially legalized all legacy commercial buildings regardless of zone. So even in the heart of residential zoning districts, we're a 19th and early 20th century city principally, we have hundreds of mixed use and commercial buildings that were built within residential context, not necessarily on our neighborhood main streets that were served by the streetcar system. This is a great example. This building, the storefront was vacant for 60 years. The Green Code gets adopted. Now it's a very simple process, no site plan review. The ground floor shop front was able to be restored and converted into a pie shop. The parking requirements alone would have made this impossible. In many ways, I think the planning profession has adopted the credo, particularly in Rust Belt cities, of planning by doing. That is one of the principles I have as a professional, as well as someone who's avocationally interested in city planning. So I use the code to my own benefit. This is my house, a mixed-use building in a residential zone that with a ground story saloon built in 1914 that I've reopened as a social club, would have required 9 off-street parking spaces, despite being only a 940 square foot space under the old code, would have required me to demolish the 2 adjacent buildings to make it happen. How insane is it that as American cities, we require bars to construct off-street parking to invite people to park at a bar, have a beer, and get back in that automobile? It is absolutely insane. But Buffalo proudly has eliminated all minimum parking requirements, and that combined with much looser use restrictions enabled me to enact my principle of planning by doing by reopening a commercial space in a residential zone. Any zoning code is an instruction manual for building out the community's vision. And I think in the case of most American cities, there is a gap between the community's vision and what the zoning ordinance enables or requires. We went out on a 7-year process, 244 public meetings to get it right. We're very proud to say that the new Unified Development Ordinance was adopted unanimously by our Common Council without a single lawsuit being filed in 2017. That was, I think, a result of a very hard and long public input process that got the consensus right. And I think what we've arrived at is one of the most progressive zoning ordinances ever adopted in North America. Thank you very kindly. Feel free to reach out to me. My email address is the bottom. Looking forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Chris. we do have some questions in the Q&A, and Meg, it looks like, has typed in a few answers to some very specific questions. So I would actually like to build on what Chris just finished talking about, because there's already been 2 questions related to parking. And the first is, in Buffalo, is there any discussion of parking maximums? Any of you might be able to answer that. Nolan, maybe from your research in your book. And then the second question, also touching on parking, is what about, how does public parking play into the mix? And the question specifically references multifamily housing that might be problematic with no parking requirements. Have you run into issues like that, or from any of your experience, have you seen any issues related to not enough parking once these parking minimums have been removed?
Yeah, I can touch on this first, and then I'm sure Chris will have thoughts. For the most part, what we see when cities completely remove minimum parking requirements is a few things. One, often you don't actually see overall reductions in parking produced, and it's actually a little bit of a problem. You have to convince the market that hey, actually you can build with less parking. What we saw in the case of Los Angeles, where we had the downtown adaptive reuse ordinance, was the overall amount of parking provided for many new developments was the same, but developers were able to find creative solutions. So they might have shared parking in potentially an unused garage that was being used by workers during the day, and that could be used by residents in the evening. Or they had offsite parking that previously would not have been allowed by the code. Again, potentially leveraging some existing underutilized parking. And then over time, as the market figures out, okay, we can rent an apartment or we can lease out office space without necessarily providing, huge on-site, huge amounts of on-site parking, then you do slowly start to see reductions over time. So, if your goal is to get a lot of parking eliminated overnight, merely removing, there are 2 fears here, right? The one fear is that no one's going to make use of these programs and everybody's going to keep building tons of parking. And then, of course, the other fear is, everybody's going to stop building parking overnight, and we're going to have these huge on-street parking problems. In most of the cases that I've seen, it's actually somewhere in the middle. Over time, you get slightly less parking, but actually probably most projects are still slightly overparked. But it's an incremental reform process, and I think that you wouldn't have been able to achieve reform any other way. As far as maximums go, most of the time I don't really see much evidence that they tend to be binding. Typically they're being set right around what the old minimum was. I would say, the place to start here is to just start by removing your minimums that are a problem. And if in the long term you're not seeing that the market sort of move in the direction that you would like to see, then I think there's potential to have that discussion. But I don't necessarily think they need to be paired at the outset.
I agree. I think we've had a mixed bag, and this has been studied a couple times. We've had some journal articles published on the impact of the parking minimums removal in Buffalo. I would say that in larger scale new construction projects that are heavily financed by big developers, there's always an off-street parking provided. And there's only been a couple of cases where, because of their locations, less parking has been provided, or in cases, no cases, and no parking has been provided. Where I think that the largest impact of parking minimum removal has been on small scale projects for small businesses, triple or quad housing developments that may not have been able to accommodate 1 space per unit. That has had a significant impact. But I think by far, small scale developers and small business owners have been the most positively affected, and that has not been as thoroughly studied. Because we moved to a much more streamlined approval process, public hearings and site plan review are now required for only new construction projects and very large adaptive reuse projects over a certain size. And very often, simple changes of use or new use that are approved administratively don't get the kind of attention that larger scale projects that make headlines in the Buffalo News make. But what I've seen most especially is that at the smaller end, particularly if you're a city that is trying to encourage smaller scale investments, small scale developers, trying to get away from, we used to have what we called and joked about as the 4 men in a room, the 4 big developers who would meet with the mayor to kind of work out the whole regulatory process. I think what we're proud of now is that we have a 334-page code, and depending on the scale of your project, you may only have to look at certain sections of that code. And if you follow the standards, you are guaranteed approval. You don't have to know anybody in City Hall. You don't have to meet with me. You can go straight to the building permit desk and have a really predictable and certain process. And that for smaller scale investors who don't necessarily have the kind of political access, they've benefited the most from that reform and others in the code.
I would just, so we do have, when we eliminated all off-street parking requirements citywide, we did include parking maximums. And at first, they actually do apply to most types of uses, but where we find it isn't necessarily the residential where they're coming in and that we apply the cap. It's more in commercial development or like event spaces, restaurants. You know, some of that new development is still wanting to provide a lot of parking. In our residential, we are seeing generally a pretty consistent reduction. You know, we're probably looking at maybe like a 0.7 stalls per unit is probably what's actually being built, maybe on average, versus, you know, 1 or 2 or 1 stall per bedroom, maybe before. So it has the most impact in residential, but I think I agree. It's what it has done mostly is make the smaller scale residential developments work, both financially and physically on the lots in places that they never would have been able to do the infill.
I'm going to ask a couple other questions. I'm going to combine a few. This was kind of directed at Meg, but I think the whole group can answer this. Is about affordability. When you begin to allow for more density, how best can you be sure the additional units be affordable rather than market rate? Then also the designs of the architectural designs were amazing. Does that increase the cost of design balance and to really have that balance of affordability when you have all the architectural design standards for the multifamily projects? How does that work?
I would love to have the conversation about affordability actually in terms of new production, because this is a conversation we have over and over and over again. To be clear, the Minneapolis 2040 plan certainly absolutely has a goal of producing affordable units, but the primary goal is to produce housing access in neighborhoods throughout the city. And so both are important, but what we recognize is that we need housing at all income levels in all neighborhoods. And so that means that if a $1 million house is purchased and torn down and replaced with a 4-unit condo, and each of those units sells for $750,000 a piece, that's okay too. Because that also is happening in some of our neighborhoods. And what we find, and I think there's data to support this, is that the best solution to housing affordability is housing production. This is a supply issue. And so what we have found over time is with the housing production that Minneapolis has had over the last 5 years, we've only seen a 1% increase in rents. And we attribute that largely to the amount of housing production that is occurring. And so it's a common theme. Yes, we have an inclusionary zoning policy, and yes, with every market rate development, we expect a certain amount of affordability, and the city is investing tens of millions of dollars a year in the production of affordable housing as well. But these things aren't all happening in isolation, right? Like we need production first and foremost, and then we can talk about policies and funding for affordability. But if that foundation isn't there to allow for that production, then other solutions for affordability aren't going to be as effective.
I guess it's really refreshing to hear you say that, Meg, and I think it's consistent with our experience as well. We're not growing as fast as Minneapolis, but that was also, I think, the perspective that we brought into the Green Code is that despite the fact we don't actually have an inclusionary zoning requirement in Buffalo, and maybe we could use one, about 20% of the housing production that is being put on the market is with subsidy from New York State, is affordable. We are, I think, building new high quality affordable housing, but the vast majority of our housing production is market rate. And we too think that the result is keeping housing costs and their rise to a minimum. And it's just refreshing to hear another professional perspective that housing production is important first at all income levels.
Another question, what are the biggest hurdles you had in getting legislative approval for the 2-layer zoning approach? What were your biggest learning curves, lessons learned in getting that through? And that was directed at Meg.
Sure. So I don't know that there was opposition to the splitting of the way we did zoning. It was embedded in the Minneapolis 2040 plan. So we're required to have a future land use map by the Metropolitan Council. So we have a future land use and a future built form map. I will say this, the president of the city council during the time that Minneapolis 2040 was adopted was a planner. And I don't know that Minneapolis 2040 would have happened if she had not been such a huge champion for the plan and had really whipped the votes that were needed. I don't know that staff alone could have done that if we didn't have a champion on the council and a really supportive mayor. And so that was probably pretty critical. Then the creation of the built form happened right after, and I don't think that there was a lot of, again, we had that same council president, and so they were able to, I think, whip the votes for that. I will say this last round with the land use component and all new council, that there's been, and not having a champion on the council has been much more difficult. I've spent hours and hours and hours in council offices, educating and explaining and educating and explaining. But I think because we have this policy document that is regulatory, we can't adopt zoning that's not in alignment with it. That would be in violation of state law. So we've really leaned on that policy document to get us over the finish line with the implementation.
And Nolan, I saw that you had something to add prior, so I want to apologize about that.
No problem. I was just gonna. I think Meg and Chris are exactly on the money on this point. And the point that I would just like to stress is, when I had these conversations about long-term housing affordability with certainly local elected officials, I think an important place to start is, what does a starter home look like in 2023? I think a lot of folks have this notion that a starter home still looks like a detached single-family home on a 5,000 square foot lot, and that's just not the case, even in middle or upper class communities now, but certainly in working class communities where you're trying to maybe get folks into homeownership for the first time and sort of close that racial wealth gap. And to do that, you're going to need a lot of typologies like townhouses, like duplexes, like 2-3 bedroom condo projects. Those are the types of affordable starter homes in 2023. And so if you're not building those, then I think you're not necessarily serious about affordability. Of course, we need resources for folks who will, even in a context of housing abundance, will never be able to afford an apartment. Absolutely, you're just going to need to kick in money there and have public programs for those folks. But if you're in a situation like where, for example, California is now, where even middle-class professionals can't afford to rent an apartment or purchase a home, that really comes down to housing abundance. And to keep a city like St. Louis, or as we've seen Minneapolis or Buffalo, a place where those folks still have a path to homeownership and rents that don't consume more than half of their income, you have to be building a lot of that housing. And all of that, I mean, here in California, the crisis has gotten so bad that we're now in a situation where we're talking about subsidies for middle and upper middle class families, right? And that's diverting resources away from your real working class families that really do need the support. So I would just echo that building a lot of market rate housing relieves pressure on public demands and opens up more possibilities to actually really fund housing support to the families that really, really need it.
That kind of leads into this next question. Are there zoning ordinances proposed to reduce investor buying in moderate income, middle income style family homes in neighborhoods? Because a lot of out of town people are buying up property and it's taken away for those first home buyers.
So I guess I'm not aware of what a zoning regulation would be that would, zoning by nature is ownership neutral. So I don't know what that would be. I think what we do in Minneapolis is we fund, so we work with emerging developers in neighborhoods and we have education and training. There's like we'll do a cohort. I think they do 2 cohorts a year, and they go through and then graduates of that program are able to have access to funding to purchase. So I think we're investing in communities to help create local developers and local investment. But I will say, when you look at our numbers for our kind of duplexes and triplexes that are being built citywide, we're not seeing that as a trend. From that investors are purchasing single family homes, tearing them down and building duplexes and triplexes in a predatory way. That just is like, the numbers just aren't bearing out. And that could be because the market just isn't quite there, and that maybe once it is, that will become a problem. But that hasn't been something we've seen so far.
Yeah, I mean, you can just look at what these firms that are buying up all of these homes say, why they're doing this, right? They have to file their financial sort of disclosure with federal regulators, and they'll say, we're buying these homes because we think in the long term there's not going to be nearly as much housing as there needs to be, and the value of this asset's going to go up. So to the extent that you can call the bluff and say, well, we're going to clear barriers to the type of infill housing that'll keep prices reasonable, the incentive for that type of investment buying, I think, goes away. So, I would say, as far as having any sort of regulation on form, I don't think that would be a zoning thing. That would be some other sort of local ordinance or some sort of state action. But what we can do with zoning is we can say, well, we're going to have a lot of new housing being built such that folks don't see housing as the scarce resource that they want to gobble up and hoard and treat as an investment asset.
Okay, next question. Which of the zoning reforms you described would you have been comfortable moving forward with or without an updated comprehensive plan? Or was waiting for that updated legal document really critical for most of these changes?
I think it's important for any community to have a vision for the future before enacting zoning reform, or the process just becomes too messy. And in the case of Buffalo, and I'm sure many other municipalities, we knew in principle how development ought to look in the future. And we knew that smart growth and sustainability principles were really our focus. And but enacting that in our code was made a lot easier because we had all that policy guidance in place already. And if you don't have a comprehensive plan, that's a real problem, because I think having the vision first is really necessary, or you don't really know what standards you might apply. And at the very least, whether you're undertaking a comprehensive zoning right for an entire city or a zoning overlay for a particular section of town, the vision always comes first. And there's nothing to enact without it. And you at least have to know what your goals and objectives are, or you'll be kind of lost.
I would agree. I think our comprehensive zoning reform wouldn't have been possible without our comprehensive plan. I will say there were probably some incremental things. We legalized SROs, single room occupancy units, for example. And so that has been successful in producing deeply affordable units in partnership with the county and some other nonprofit partners that we have worked with. The legalization of ADUs, but some of these larger things, I don't think we could have gotten, our 13 council members, or a majority of our 13 council members on board to get through a political process without having that vision to lean back on.
I'll leave with this last question. We have some, and I apologize to those who attended today. We can't get to everyone. One is that if the panelists have any thoughts, feelings toward special zoning districts that are geared specifically toward redevelopment and are rezoned once a new use has been established. I'm thinking of the urban redevelopment zoning district that Kansas City uses to attract planned development and, in theory, streamline the process of redevelopment. Could a city like St. Louis, who owns thousands of vacant parcels in need of reinvestment, use something like urban redevelopment districts to attract development?
I think that there's a debate among zoning practitioners, particularly in the form-based world, about incremental versus comprehensive. Incremental is very often the choice because that is the kind of political cards that a municipality deals with. But I think Buffalo offers a lesson on the advantages of undertaking a comprehensive multi-year rewrite. And because we are able to tackle so many topics under the one large kind of project umbrella, that if we had gone an incremental approach, like if we put minimum parking requirements alone and their elimination alone through the Common Council, I don't think it would have been adopted. I really don't. And when I look back on the early parts of the zoning code rewrite process, you know, the Common Council at the time was considering a chicken coop ordinance, which took 8 months for them to get through. And if we had to bite size out those reforms over time, we'd still be stuck. And but thankfully we had a mayor that was committed through the thick and thin to make this a legacy project. And he wanted to kind of leave City Hall much more business friendly than the one he entered. We had a notorious cumbersome bureaucracy and rules that made no sense in a process that produced unproductive outcomes. And we needed the giant reform. And so few cities do this, and the advantages are so large if you have the political capital to undertake it. So I would say that, you know, there are so many different needed reforms in the zoning universe in virtually every American city that looking to Buffalo as an example, if the political will is there, is the way to go. And if that doesn't work, then certainly incremental reform is useful. But I think one of the most pleasant surprises out of the Green Code is that in adopting a citywide rewrite, eliminating 1,804 pages of regulations and starting from scratch, we're seeing investment we never expected to see it when we started this whole process. And every neighborhood in the city has, not a single neighborhood has been untouched by new development. That is consistent with the vision we set out with when the code was announced back in 2010 and ultimately adopted in 2017. Obviously, you know, the prediction is hard, especially about the future. It's a Yogi Berra phrase, but I think when municipalities say we're going to focus on this area of town, sometimes it ignores opportunities that we never thought about, like Silo City, which I referenced earlier in the conversation. A district of vacant grain elevators. It was always a giant development question. We never dreamed that a Miami developer would come up and build hundreds of housing units, office space, and artist lofts. And but that has taken place. It's being built. And if we take it a much more incremental approach, it might not be on the table.
Well, thank you so much to our great panelists, very informative presentations. We unfortunately could not get to all of the questions, but we do have them saved, and our panelists have so graciously agreed to follow up via email. So we will have those answers available. The final recording will go on the APA YouTube channel. And then I just want to remind everybody that Friday is Bike to Work Day. So if you can shift your commute on Friday, I would encourage everybody to trade 4 wheels for 2 wheels. And if you're in St. Louis and you're biking downtown, we're organizing a bike bus. So let me know if you want to join the commute. And thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Keep up the great work.